The Queen's ship was lost in a war zone. Then a human risked everything. HFY. The Broken Symphony Commander. Lyra Novak's fingers traced the unusual wave patterns on her console, a frown deepening on her face. The Harmonia's central harmonic. Core shouldn't be producing these oscillations. Subtle, yes, but growing more pronounced with each passing hour. Something's wrong, she murmured, brushing a lock of auburn hair from her eyes. The Etherean starship hummed around her, its massive crystalline systems pulsing with light that would have seemed magical if Lyra hadn't spent 3 years studying their quantum resonance technology. As the only human engineer aboard the Harmonia, she'd grown accustomed to being overlooked. The Etherians, with their luminescent skin and mathematically perfect society, tolerated her presence as part of an interspecies exchange program. They valued her insights into primitive mechanical systems, but seldom invited her input on their sophisticated harmonics. The deck trembled beneath her boots, barely perceptible, but definitely there. "Computer, magnify section J7 of the core harmonics," Lyra commanded. The holographic display expanded, showing microscopic fractures in what should have been a perfectly aligned energy pattern. "Warning," the ship's voice announced in its melodic, Etherian cadence. "Minor harmonic destabilization detected in tertiary systems." Lyra grabbed her toolkit and headed for the bridge. The Etherians might dismiss her concerns, but she couldn't ignore her instincts. The ship was approaching Kethris Station, a research outpost orbiting a neutron star, and even minor system failures could be catastrophic this close to such powerful gravitational forces. High Admiral Tenzin Kalar stood on the command platform, his tall willowy frame silhouetted against the viewport. The neutron star loomed in the distance, a tiny sphere of unimaginable density, wrapped in a halo of blue-white light. "Admiral," Lyra called, approaching with her diagnostic tablet extended. "I'm detecting unusual patterns in the harmonic core. The oscillations are growing more pronounced and—" "Commander Novak," Kalar interrupted, his luminescent eyes narrowing slightly. "Our systems are operating within acceptable parameters." "With respect, sir, these readings suggest otherwise." She projected her findings onto the main display. "These microfractures in the harmonic pattern, they're spreading." First Officer Viel glided forward, his movements fluid like all Etherians. "The human doesn't understand our technology," he said dismissively. "The patterns are self-correcting." Kalar studied the display. "Our engineers report no significant anomalies, Commander. Your concern is noted, but..." The ship lurched violently, sending everyone stumbling. Emergency lights flashed as the harmonic core emitted a discordant tone that made Lyra's teeth ache. "Status report," Kalar demanded, recovering his balance with inhuman grace. "Primary harmonic junction failing," reported the systems officer, her voice betraying rare Etherian alarm. "Resonance cascading through secondary systems." Lyra studied her tablet, mind racing. "This isn't random failure. The pattern is too orderly, too sequential." She looked up at Kalar. "Admiral, I believe the Harmonia has been sabotaged." 2 hours later, the massive starship shuddered continuously as evacuation pods streamed from its launch bays. The harmonic core's destabilization had accelerated beyond the Etherian engineers' ability to contain it. Lyra worked feverishly in engineering, bypassing failing systems and analyzing the spreading pattern of destruction. What she found chilled her blood. "It's brilliant, actually," she told Kalar when he appeared beside her, his normally silver skin now tinged with stress-darkened blue. "Whoever did this understood that Etherian systems are designed with quantum entanglement. You see simultaneity as natural." "It is natural," Kalar replied stiffly. "All things exist in harmony, but humans don't think that way," Lyra continued, pointing to her display. "We think linearly, sequentially. The saboteur exploited that difference. They created a cascading failure that moves system by system, something your engineers would never anticipate because it's fundamentally illogical to Etherian physics." Another violent tremor shook the deck plates. A support beam groaned overhead. "How long until total core collapse?" Kalar asked. "At current rates?" "Less than 40 minutes. Lyra met his gaze. The evacuation won't be complete by then. The Admiral's posture stiffened. I will remain until the last civilian is away. Admiral, Lyra hesitated, then plunged ahead. I think I can stop this. Our finest engineers could not. Your engineers are looking for a harmonic solution to a disharmonic problem, she interrupted. They're trying to fix quantum entanglement when they should be treating this like a mechanical chain reaction. Kalar's expression was unreadable. What do you propose? I need to manually sever the connections between the affected systems, create fire breaks in the cascade. It's crude by your standards, but it might work. That would violate every principle of harmonic engineering, First Officer Vielle protested, appearing from a nearby corridor. The systems must remain in resonance or they'll fail completely. They're already failing, Lyra countered. We need to think beyond traditional Etherian methods. Kalar stood perfectly still, the weight of command visible in his posture. The Harmonia wasn't just a ship. It was a cultural masterpiece, the culmination of 10,000 years of Etherian technological development. The core chamber is flooded with harmonic radiation, he said finally. Even with protective gear, you would have minutes at most. I understand the risk, Lyra replied simply. Another system failed somewhere deep in the ship, sending a mournful tone echoing through the corridors. The evacuation warning increased in urgency. Kalar's gaze shifted to the viewport, where escape pods streaked away like luminous tears against the void. The last civilian vessel departs in 12 minutes. By tradition, I must leave on the final command pod 3 minutes after. Admiral, Vielle protested, you cannot seriously consider allowing a human to— Silence, Kalar commanded, his tone leaving no room for argument. He turned back to Lyra. Commander Novak, do you truly believe you can save this ship? Lyra met his gaze steadily. I believe I can try. Something shifted in Kalar's expression. Not quite hope, but perhaps the first acknowledgement that Etherian wisdom might not hold all answers. Very well, he said, his voice like polished stone. What do you need? 10 minutes later, Lyra stood before the massive doors leading to the harmonic core chamber, dressed in an Etherian protection suit modified for her shorter human frame. It felt awkward and too tight across her shoulders, but it was better than nothing. On the command deck, Kalar had dismissed his remaining officers. The evacuation countdown showed 8 minutes remaining. By sacred tradition, no Etherian monarch had ever abandoned their vessel before the appointed time, not in 7,000 years of spacefaring history. His slender fingers hovered over the final evacuation order, then moved instead to open a direct channel to Lyra. Commander, I am monitoring your progress. The core destabilization has reached 93%. In the antechamber, Lyra checked her toolkit one final time. Open the core doors, please. The massive doors parted, revealing a swirling maelstrom of light. At the center hovered the harmonic core, a perfect sphere of crystalline energy that should have pulsed with serene regularity. Now it fluctuated wildly, bleeding harmful radiation with each disruption. I'm going in, Lyra said, stepping through the threshold. The doors sealed behind her with unsettling finality. The heat struck her immediately, even through the protective suit. The radiation meter on her wrist already climbed at an alarming rate. I can see you, Commander. Kalar's voice came through, her helmet. The core's instability is increasing rapidly. Understood, she replied, forcing her hands to remain steady as she moved toward the primary junction panel. I'm going to need you to be my eyes out there. This might not be pretty by Etherian standards. She pulled out a manual bypass tool, crude by Etherian technology but perfect for what she had in mind. Let's save your ship, she murmured, and got to work. As Lyra's hands moved with practiced precision, Kalar watched through the monitoring system, fascination overriding his initial skepticism. The human worked with strange intuition, treating the ship not as an abstract system of harmonies but almost as a living entity with physical needs. The firebreak at Junction 7 is holding, he reported, watching the cascading failures halt at the boundaries Lyra had created. But the strain is being redirected to auxiliary systems, Expected, she grunted, sweat beading on her forehead despite the suit's cooling system. I need to create a controlled failure path. Better to sacrifice non-essential systems than let the cascade reach the core. Another violent tremor shook the ship. Warning klaxons shifted to a higher pitch, the final warning before catastrophic failure. 2 minutes until mandatory evacuation, the ship's computer announced. Commander, Kalar said, his voice impossibly calm. You must leave now. Protocol demands it. Resonance of trust. For the next 7 minutes, Admiral Kalar and Commander Novak worked in perfect synchrony. Kalar's fingers flew across the command console, disabling safeguards and overriding security protocols that had remained inviolate for generations. Meanwhile, Lyra positioned herself at each disruptor, preparing for simultaneous deactivation. Harmonic radiation levels are approaching lethal threshold, Kalar warned, his voice tight with concern. Even with protection, you have perhaps 3 minutes of viable consciousness remaining. Lyra's breathing came in short gasps as she connected the last bypass circuit. The heat inside the suit had become nearly unbearable, the radiation counter on her wrist blinking an urgent red warning. Almost there, she managed. I've identified all 5 disruptors. They're brilliant, actually. Whoever did this understood both Etherian harmonics and linear engineering principles. Another violent tremor shook the ship. A support beam crashed down nearby, missing Lyra by centimeters. On my mark, she said, heart pounding against her ribs. 3, 2, 1. Now. 5 distinct clicks echoed through the chamber as she triggered the simultaneous deactivation. For one terrifying moment, nothing happened. The core continued, its erratic pulsing perhaps even more violently. It's not working, Kalar reported, tension breaking through his usually measured tone. Wait, Lyra insisted, watching the core. The harmonic field needs to re-establish itself. It's like a symphony finding its rhythm after a discordant note. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the wild fluctuations of the core began to smooth. The painful discordance that had filled the chamber softened, becoming more regular, more familiar. The sphere of energy at the center pulsed once, twice, and then settled into a gentle, consistent glow. Harmonic resonance stabilizing, Kalar breathed, disbelief coloring his words. Core integrity returning to nominal parameters. Lyra smiled weakly, the edges of her vision beginning to blur. Told you so, she murmured. The radiation meter on her wrist had long since maxed out. Her legs buckled beneath her as the adrenaline that had kept her going began to fade. Commander? Lyra? Respond. Kalar's voice seemed to come from very far away. Mission accomplished, she managed before darkness claimed her. On the command deck, Kalar's luminescent eyes widened as Lyra collapsed onto the chamber floor. The vital signs transmitted from her suit showed dangerously elevated radiation exposure and declining life functions. Evacuation protocol override, he commanded, his voice carrying the full authority of his rank. This is Admiral Tenzin Kalar, initiating emergency protocol Zenith. The ship's computer chimed acknowledgement as Kalar strode toward the lift. Sir, it responded, all remaining crew have evacuated. Per tradition, you must... Tradition will wait. Kalar cut it off. A life hangs in the balance. The lift deposited him near the core access corridor. Warning lights still flashed, though the ship's tremors had ceased. Kalar moved with purpose toward the radiation gear storage, selecting the heaviest protection suit available. Sir, the ship's computer protested. Harmonic radiation levels in the core chamber remain hazardous. Etherian physiology is not immune to prolonged exposure. Noted, Kalar replied simply, sealing the helmet. When the core chamber doors parted, the ambient radiation washed over him like a physical wave. Even through the suit he could feel its effects. A slight vertigo, a tingling across his silver skin. For a human, it would be far worse. Lyra lay crumpled near the central control panel, motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. Kalar moved to her side with swift efficiency, checking her suit for breaches. Finding none, he carefully lifted her, surprisingly light in his arms, and began the journey back to the chamber doors. "Commander Novak saved this vessel," he said aloud, partly to the ship's computer and partly to himself. "No Etherean will forget this day." As he carried her through the doors, medical protocols engaged automatically. Decontamination fields swept over them both, neutralizing the residual radiation clinging to their suits. "Admiral," the computer, reported, "Commander Novak's life signs are critical but stabilizing. Standard treatment protocols for radiation exposure are loading, but what?" Kalar demanded, still cradling Lyra in his arms as he strode toward the medical bay. "Human physiology requires significantly different treatment parameters. Our standard protocols may be insufficient." Kalar's jaw tightened beneath his helmet. "Then adapt them. Use everything in our xenobiology database. This human saved 10,000 Etherean lives today. We will not fail her." Lyra awoke to the soft hum of advanced medical equipment. The familiar pressure of gravity felt slightly off, lighter than Earth standard, but heavier than she remembered on the Harmonia. Her body ached deeply, a bone weariness that suggested serious cellular damage, but the burning sensation she recalled from the core chamber had subsided. "The treatment is proceeding adequately," came a melodic voice she didn't recognize. "Though, our protocols required significant modification for human biology." Lyra forced her eyes open. The ceiling above her shimmered with diagnostic data, most in Etherean script she couldn't read, but some translated to human medical terms. She was in the Harmonia's medical bay, but something was different. The ship's familiar hum had changed, subtly. "We've established orbit around Kethris Station," came Admiral Kalar's voice from nearby. "The neutron star's radiation actually proved beneficial in recalibrating our harmonic systems after your unconventional repairs." Lyra turned her head slightly, wincing at the effort. Kalar stood by the viewport, his tall frame silhouetted against the stars. He had exchanged his command uniform for simpler attire, though the insignia of his rank remained. "The ship," she managed, her throat dry. "It survived?" "More than survived." Kalar approached her bedside, his movements carrying their usual fluid grace, though something about his posture seemed less rigid than before. "The Harmonia is functional at 87% capacity. Our engineers are still somewhat baffled by your solutions, but they cannot argue with the results." Lyra attempted to sit up, but a gentle force field held her in place. "Medical protocol," Kalar explained. "Your cellular repair is only 63% complete. How long have I been unconscious?" 4 days, 7 hours, he replied precisely. "I remained with the ship while the evacuation vessels returned. Most were surprised to find the Harmonia intact, and probably surprised to find me still alive," Lyra added with a weak smile. Kalar tilted his head slightly. "Some more than others." His expression grew serious. "We have identified the saboteur, a technician named Javal, who disappeared during the evacuation. Security protocols have been updated throughout the fleet." "He wasn't working alone," Lyra said with certainty. "The design of those disruptors required intimate knowledge of both Etherean and human engineering principles." "Yes," Kalar agreed. "Preliminary investigation suggests Javal had connections to the Tholian ascendancy. They have long coveted our harmonic technology." Lyra absorbed this information silently. The Tholians, a militant species from a neighboring sector, had been expanding their territory aggressively in recent years. A sabotaged Etherean flagship would serve their interests well. "What happens now?" she asked finally. Kalar's luminescent eyes studied her with unexpected warmth. "Now, Commander Novak, you heal. And then, if you are willing, the Etherean Science Council has expressed interest in learning more about your approach to our technology." "My primitive linear thinking?" Lyra asked with a hint of amusement. "I would not phrase it thus," Kalar replied seriously. "I watched you work in that chamber, Lyra. You spoke to the ship not as a collection of harmonic principles, but as a living entity with its own logic. No Etherean would approach technology this way." He hesitated, then slowly extended his hand, a gesture he must have researched as it was not Etherian custom. Lyra took it carefully, surprised by the coolness of his skin. Perhaps, Kalar continued, there is something to be learned from the integration of our approaches. Harmony need not mean uniformity. 3 weeks later, Lyra stood on the observation deck watching the stars streak by as the Harmonia cruised at full power. Her body had healed remarkably under the advanced Etherian treatments, though the medical officer warned she might always carry some sensitivity to harmonic radiation. The door whispered open behind her. She didn't need to turn to know it was Kalar. His footsteps had a distinctive cadence that she'd grown to recognize. "The Science Council has approved your recommendations," he announced without preamble. "All Etherian vessels will incorporate your firebreak design into their harmonic systems." Lyra smiled, still gazing at the stars. "I'll expect royalties, of course." A moment of silence followed before Kalar responded. "You are employing humor. Attempting to, at least." She turned to face him. "Your scientists adapted quickly to the concept. Once they overcame their initial resistance." Kalar moved to stand beside her at the viewport. The notion that imperfection, deliberate imperfection, could strengthen a system rather than weaken it. This is not how Etherians think. "Humans have an old saying," Lyra offered. "The perfect is the enemy of the good." "Curious," Kalar mused. "We have always sought perfection through harmony. The idea that disconnection could be beneficial challenges millennia of philosophy." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the ship passed a nebula that painted the void in swirls of crimson and gold. "I've received new orders," Lyra said finally. "Starfleet wants me back for debriefing." Kalar turned to her, his expression carefully neutral. "You are leaving the Harmonia." "Only temporarily. It seems I've been officially reassigned as the human liaison to the Etherian fleet." She smiled up at him. "Apparently, saving a flagship earns you some career capital." "This is acceptable," Kalar decided, the faintest hint of satisfaction in his tone. "The Harmonia will require your perspective as we implement the new hybrid systems." "Just the Harmonia?" Lyra asked, raising an eyebrow. Kalar's skin rippled with a subtle luminescence that she had come to recognize as the Etherian equivalent of a smile. "I find your disharmonious thought patterns increasingly valuable, Commander Novak." "High praise indeed, Admiral." A soft tone chimed, indicating an incoming transmission. Kalar checked his wrist communicator. "The Etherian High Council," he explained. "They wish to formally recognize your service." "They'll expect me to follow protocol, I assume." "Naturally." Kalar straightened his already perfect posture. "Though I have taken the liberty of informing them that humans occasionally require adaptations to traditional ceremonies." Lyra laughed, genuinely touched by his consideration. "I'm adaptable." "As it seems, are we?" Kalar gestured toward the corridor. "Shall we, Commander? A new harmony awaits." Together they walked from the observation deck, human and Etherian side by side, different in nearly every way, yet moving in a rhythm that was, perhaps, the beginning of a greater harmony than either civilization had achieved alone. As the Harmonia continued its journey through the stars, its systems hummed with a new cadence, neither purely Etherian nor human, but something uniquely powerful in its hybrid resonance. It was, Lyra thought, rather like a conversation between different worlds, complex, occasionally discordant, but infinitely more interesting than a single voice speaking alone. And somewhere in that resonance, there was music.